This is part two of our messaging series. So, diving into a little bit of, how do we deal with misinformation from a communication standpoint? So, today I'm going to be talking about using audience segmentation. I'm going to be using that interchangeably with elicitation research because when we're talking about correcting misinformation, we focus on beliefs that our audience holds and we elicit those beliefs through this method that I'm going to be talking about. So, a little agenda for us. We're just going to briefly overview what is audience segmentation. I'm going to talk about how you can measure beliefs in your audience to segment. I'll provide two ways that you can segment your audience using qualitative and quantitative research. These are two studies that I've done using a theoretical framework that we're going to talk about today to elicit salient beliefs from our audience to develop targeted messaging. And then we can briefly touch on, I think this could be good for discussion maybe. We could briefly touch on next steps for using elicitation and audience segmentation research for message design. I will say that today we're not going to step into the message design space. We're talking about how do we figure out what types of things we need to target in our audiences that would then get us to the point of creating effective messaging. So we won't be talking about that piece, but first let's talk about what is audience segmentation in general. Um, Audience segmentation is really just the process of dividing up a population or a group of people into meaningful subgroups based on shared psychological determinants of behavior. And this is kind of in contrast to demographic characteristics alone. I think that there's this perception that when we're trying to target audiences, we need to solely rely on demographic information. And that is not what we would do from a communication science standpoint, though it could be included in the analysis. But ultimately, segmentation is focused on identifying how people think and what beliefs they hold prior to message exposure, prior to misinformation exposure. It's not just who they are demographically or who they are on paper. And so when we think about beliefs, we think about how groups differ in regard to their perceived outcomes of a health intervention or a health behavior. We think about what the social influences are. In other words, what do I think other people are doing about this health behavior? And what do I think people around me and close to me want me to do regarding a health behavior? And then we also think about perceived barriers. So there are tons of barriers and facilitators to people performing health behaviors and acting on messages. And we need to know what those are so that we can properly target our messages. And so ultimately, these differences in these perceived outcomes, social influences and barriers predict message receptivity and behavioral intentions. So why is the segmentation process necessary? A couple of issues with misinformation correction and misinformation research. Oftentimes, when we're doing this type of research, we kind of assume a uniform knowledge deficit in our audience. We assume and treat the audience as cognitively identical, which is a misstep. And then oftentimes, the misinformation correction literature produces mixed or even null effects. We see this with narrative studies and narrative correction. Sometimes non-narrative correction is evaluated as even more credible, which is in contrast to what we typically think about using narratives. We think about narratives as the gold standard. One example of this was in a recent study published in 2025, where pregnant women with skeptical attitudes toward vaccination, so previously held beliefs, for them, narratives elicited a stronger negative emotional response, and it led to decreased debunking efficacy and intention among that population to seek information about vaccines. And so, with that kind of like mixed evidence and sometimes even backfire results, we have to really think about, how are we targeting different audiences with our messages? And we know that audience differ in why they resist, what they believe prior to message exposure. In the example I just gave you, it was skepticism toward vaccination. Audiences differ in who they trust and what feels possible, going back to those barriers and facilitators. So here's kind of a breakdown of traditional audience segmentation that we see that is often less effective in misinformation correction. Things like segmenting alone based on age, race, income, these tend to be quite descriptive and they're more focused on media targeting, broader, wider audiences. But what I'm going to talk about today is a theory-based approach using communication theory. And what we see is that targeting beliefs and things like norms and control perceptions or even efficacy perceptions are more predictive of behavior and intention. and they provide a more targeted messaging strategy. So segmentation allows communication to match the psychological drivers of behavior. Now, the question is, how can you measure beliefs in your audience to segment? We just said that demographics alone might not be the best approach. And so we focus on things like beliefs. Okay, so this seems like a big model. I'm going to break it down. This is the reasoned action approach, previously called theory of planned behavior, the theory of reasoned action. It had tons of names. The current model is called the reasoned action approach. It's what I draw on for a lot of my communication research. And we use this as an audience segmentation engine. And what you'll see on the far right is behavior. So that's the behavior that we want people to take up or enact or even adopt, typically a health behavior. We also see that intention is the primary predictor of behavior. So, oftentimes in communication research, we can't always fully measure behavior. So, we measure its antecedent, which is behavioral intention. I intend to get a vaccine during my pregnancy. We also see that there's three core global measures. This is what the reason action approach says. There's three core global measures of intention, those being attitudes, norms, and self-efficacy or perceived behavioral control. And each of these three global measures has associated beliefs with it. The beliefs for each of these three global measures are what we want to ask our audience to better understand what beliefs they hold about the intended health behavior that we're interested in. This is a really powerful model. The three global measures can explain up to 65% of the variance in behavioral intention. So it's a really effective model. So I'm going to go through each of these three for you and talk about what they are, how we measure them, and how we're going to use them to create messages. So the first one we're going to talk about here is intention. Intention is the strongest predictor of behavior, and it's critical for understanding how to segment audiences. What we know about measuring this, we want to measure this in our audience to perform audience segmentation. We know that behavioral intention needs to have a couple of core factors here when we're measuring it, like on a survey or even in a qualitative interview, that needs to be relevant to action, target, context, and time. So here's an example of asking this question to an audience and getting them to respond to it that considers all four components. I intend to receive a flu vaccine during my current pregnancy, right? Consider action, target, when it's recommended by my healthcare provider, context, this fall, time. So we have all four elements, and this is going to be really important to make sure we're measuring the right thing in our audience. So that's intention. The next thing that I want to talk about are the three predictors of intention. So attitude and its beliefs are part of this. So we'll talk about attitudes first. The attitudes are a core predictor of behavioral intention, and they're really asking the audience how favorable or unfavorable do you feel about a health behavior? They're predicted by behavioral beliefs. Remember, beliefs being key to audience segmentation. And these beliefs that we ask our audience can be instrumental or experiential. Some examples of experiential beliefs. Let's go back to the vaccine during pregnancy example. We would ask participants or our audience to describe how painful or not painful it is on a sliding scale. And then for instrumental beliefs, we might ask them if it's effective, how much they believe it's effective versus ineffective, and beneficial versus harmful. So these are some of the key pieces here for understanding attitudinal beliefs as a predictor of intention. The next one we're going to talk about here is norms. You'll see again, we have norms as a key predictor of intention with associated beliefs there in the model. So beliefs or norms are really about social proof. And there's two components that we want to ask our audience regarding their norms. We want to ask them about descriptive norms, their perceptions of what others like them are doing. So, what are other people from your sex, your gender, your age, your income bracket? What do you think they're doing regarding the health behavior? The second component of this is injunctive norms. This is what we think others want us to do. Okay. And when we think about others, this is social pressure from others, people in our lives, we think of people called, the reasoned action approach calls it reference. Normative beliefs are guided by reference. Reference are just people in our lives that have the most pressure and power to influence our behavior. And so if we were measuring descriptive norms, we might ask about reference like women, sisters, friends, doctors, coworkers, influencers when thinking about the example of getting vaccinated during pregnancy. So we might say other sisters, other influencers who are pregnant are receiving a flu vaccine in the fall when recommended by their healthcare provider. Notice that we're keeping consistent with the context, the time, those features. And then for injunctive norms, we would ask other women, my sisters, my friends, doctors want me to receive a flu vaccination when I'm pregnant and it's recommended by my healthcare provider. So this is normative pressure and really important for understanding behavioral intention. Here's an example. This was pretty common during the COVID-19 pandemic where they leveraged descriptive norms. Notice that 91% of people or of students practice public health behaviors to avoid spreading COVID-19. That's a descriptive norm. It's telling your audience what other people like them are doing. The audience for this ad was college students. The final thing I want to talk about in the model is self-efficacy or perceived behavioral control. And of course, that has a subset of beliefs too. So, this is a core predictor of behavioral intention, one of the three global measures, and it's made up of two components, capacity and autonomy. Capacity is our ability to perform a recommended behavior. So, if someone recommends a health behavior to me, do I think I can actually perform it? Autonomy is the extent to which performing the behavior is under that individual's control. So, this would ask an audience member to question, are there other factors in my life that would prevent me from doing this behavior, even if I wanted to? Now, these two pieces here, capacity and autonomy, are predicted by barriers and facilitators' beliefs. And these are the types of questions we would want to ask our audience to understand their efficacy and perceived behavioral control. So we would ask audiences to rate their confidence. Let's go back to the flu vaccine example, in getting a flu vaccine during pregnancy, given the following contexts. It was at odds with my political views, I had uncertainty about the effectiveness, or even I had uncertainty about the safety. And we would get statistical information to understand how much of a barrier these examples are to them behaving in a certain way and getting a flu vaccine. So, I want to show you two ways that you can ask these questions pertaining to attitudes, norms, and perceived behavioral control in both a qualitative and a quantitative context. And these are both pulling from studies that I've done in the past. The qualitative one is an elicitation study. We use the reasoned action approach to elicit these beliefs in regard to why college students are getting health information from social media influencers. And then we did a quantitative elicitation study eliciting these beliefs using the reasoned action approach to understand why college students would or would not adopt O-pill, the first over-the-counter birth control pill. So, for the qualitative elicitation study, this is where we were asking young people their beliefs about getting health information from influencers. You can see down the left, we have the reasoned action pieces, the core constructs, attitudes, normative pressure, and perceived behavioral control. For attitudes, we did a qualitative focus group study and we asked them, what are some good things that could happen if you could get information from an influencer? What are some bad things? For normative pressure in the focus groups, we asked them, who do you think are people in your life that think you should get information from an influencer, right? That's social pressure. And then, are there any people in your life who think you shouldn't get health information from an influencer? We also asked which of these people in your life is doing this behavior? Who in your life is actually getting health information from an influencer? What's your perception of that? Descriptive norms. Then for perceived behavioral control, we asked them two questions. What are some of the things that might make it easy? Facilitators of health behaviors, right? What makes it easy to get health information from an influencer? And then the barriers question, what are some things that would make it really hard to get health information from an influencer? I'm just going to show you some of the findings, and then the next step would be to use these to develop messages to target some of these beliefs. For attitudinal beliefs, they believed that getting health information from an influencer was advantageous because of the trial and error approach. Influencers are trialing health products for me and then letting me know if I should do it or not, if it's good or bad. So I trust them to do that, was the attitude. We also had negative attitudes, though. Some said, well, this could cause negative health outcomes if I were to get information from these people. We also had normative pressure. They said that parents and older siblings would not approve of this behavior. There were generational differences. And then for control, they said that a facilitator was this is really convenient. Getting health information from doctors is really inconvenient. It's costly, it takes time, and it's challenging to make appointments. And then a barrier, they said, however, these people online are not always credible sources of information. So we would take these beliefs that were elicited through the qualitative focus groups using attitudes, norms, and control to develop counter messaging to challenge some of these beliefs. And that's how we would approach misinformation in a qualitative context. Now, we also have the quantitative approach that I'm going to talk about. This approach is a little bit more technical, but it's still using the reasoned action approach and it's still eliciting beliefs. So the first thing that we did in this study was we measured behavioral intention. How likely are you, what is your intention to start using O pill when it becomes available? The first over-the-counter birth control pill. This is a proxy to behavior. We measured this on a 1 to 7 point scale, 1 being I definitely wouldn't do that. I definitely wouldn't use O pill, 7 being I would definitely use O pill. We recoded it into a binary variable. So if they responded 0 to 4, right, not at all, or maybe, maybe not, we coded that as 0. Those people were non-intenders. That audience was going to be far less likely to use Opil. And then we coded 5 to 7 responses. Yes, I would do that. Yes, I would definitely start using Opil as 1 and label these people as intenders. So now we have a variable from the audience that we've surveyed that tells us who is an intender of the behavior and who is not an intender of the behavior. We also made sure to measure beliefs for attitudes, normative pressure and control, the reasoned action approach global constructs on continuous 1 to 7 point scales. We would run t-tests then to understand differences in beliefs by intenders versus non-intenders. And what this does is that it separates individuals resistant or uncertain about adoption from individuals who are already inclined toward the behavior, just from these survey measures. And then we would use those that vary by intender and non-intender to design messages. I'm going to show you an example. So the bolded, you can see the bolded items. We have the average belief for non-intenders and the average belief for intenders. These are control beliefs. So these are whether or not people think they have the efficacy to perform the behavior if the following situations were to occur. Now, you can see the first one there. It's how likely would you be able to, use O-pill even if it was at odds with your political beliefs? We see that the difference in the beliefs between intenders and non-intenders, the bold indicates that there's a significant difference. When there's a significant difference in these two audiences, we know that's when we want to create a message targeted about that belief. So in this case, there's a significant difference between the two groups. We would want to create messaging that would challenge the fact that OPIL might be at odds with someone's political views. Now, another example of this, we measured the belief. Well, what if it like required you to take the pill every day at the same time? Would that be a barrier to you using O-pill? You can see that the difference in the average beliefs between non-intenders and intenders was not significant. So that's not a messaging feature or the type of message we would want to create and target for this audience. Just because there's no difference between the groups, it wouldn't be something that we would want to pursue. You can see some other differences in the bolded items. Uncertainty about its effectiveness was significantly different. We would want to target uncertainty about effectiveness in our messaging because those groups significantly vary. In terms of like future reading, and if you're interested in learning more about measuring these beliefs in your audiences to further focus your messaging and tailor your messaging, predicting and changing behavior, the reason action approach. This is the theoretical book that it all comes from, and there are sample measures in the appendix of everything you could think of regarding this model that will, carry you through doing an audience segmentation. So I always like to recommend that. And then just some key takeaways. Audience segmentation should be theoretical and push beyond demographics. I would say that it can be used in conjunction with demographics. We recently, my team and I did a survey on intention to get a pap smear, and we looked at all the different beliefs, like attitudes and norms, and we actually segmented it by different racial and ethnic groups. And so we were combining the demographic and the theoretical beliefs in that example. We don't want to assume what our audience believes. We want to survey them to understand what their current beliefs are so that we can target our messaging. The reason action approach is a great way to analyze audience beliefs and engage in audience segmentation research. It is not the only model that you can do this with. It's just the core one that I use that I find to be pretty effective, especially in the context of misinformation. You can measure your audience's beliefs using qualitative or quantitative approaches. I showed you two examples of that today. And then after measuring audience beliefs and figuring out where those differences lie and what some of the misinformed beliefs are, that's where we use the findings to develop messages that target those misperceptions. And